Okay. Oh, more short reviews. I'm not even taking a breath today. Just cranking out my yap yap. Uh, so a pretty good mix. Another nine. I decided that nine is like 10 is for some reason a point of exhaustion for my brain. So it's our fourth set in September. I'm really trying to cover as much as possible. Um, this week is all about variety and actually very sophisticated and enjoyable variety, which um, just happens to be some of the biggest releases of the month for the general public who are interested in heavy metal. But there's also a lot of non-metal here, as you'll see. Obviously, the biggest release of this week for a lot of the general metal fandom is, of course, the what 12th Behemoth album. Am I right? Is that the 12th? Uh, so yeah, what is there to say about Behemoth? I think at some point when an album when a band puts out this many albums, and most of them are a lot of them are pretty similar. They've sort of established their sound, and they're now beginning to play with what was once on the periphery is now a big part of their sound. So we're in the post the Satanist era of Behemoth, and that means more atmospheric, more dramatically stated. The vocal style has really become elaborate and a big focus of the band, whereas the riffing and the brutality of it is still there, but it's not their purpose anymore. They made that album five times. Now, I'm not one of those people who considers Demigod their peak. I think it's just their. I really like Pandemonic Incantations. I think Satanica is their best record, so keep that in mind. Like, for me, I love the first two records, but that's a different band for me in a lot of ways. And so, yeah, for me, Satanica is like the and Zos Kias Cultus. Those are like that's kind of where Behemoth uh, showed their ingenuity first. It was the wildest kind of thing around, and their transition into sort of a brutal death metal punch was really influential. And it's not a nostalgia thing for me. It's more like I go back and I listen to their discography, and we get to a point of real cold and clinical production values after Demigod. So that's why a lot of people feel like Demigod was a peak, is because they got the budget, they kind of sterilized that sound, and that was their way of like basically lording over that style for longer than most bands that were similar could. Like you know, Nile is probably a good example of a band that just couldn't maintain the public's interest with the songs they were writing, and their lineup just seemed to just be all over the place. And no offense to that. I mean, whatever. A time and a place is where they sat, and Behemoth have managed to stay in the conversation for interesting reasons. Uh, that's where I get. So this is where I get in my thought process, where a lot of the reasons that people still bother with this music aren't interesting to me. Like, uh, absolute support to cancer survivors out there. I don't think that really it energized the music in a way that was inspiring, but really the albums weren't that interesting to begin with. I think The Satanist was what was interesting musically, and that's where like my interest caught back up with the band after 2007 or so. Um, and I think that being censored in Poland was that matters. That does culturally matter. Like it's very important to me, but it really that has to do with it has nothing to do with my experience listening to the band. It has everything to do with human rights and free speech and uh, challenging, punching up, basically, and the fact that everyone should be able to punch up as hard as they want until they've just shattered whatever. Anyway, we're not going to go there. Okay. there was a point where the Satanist was what surprising that you saw the more bands chose to create more atmospheric but still brutal black death metal when the Satanist released, because it acted as sort of a template for a lot of people who I don't think found that side of extreme metal interesting anymore, because the atmospheric crap had really taken over through a lot of the 2010s at that point. And it was an important directional release for a lot of groups. Um, I would, I probably prefer like an Order of Apollyon record. I probably prefer Aosoth. Like there's a lot of really good French black death metal that's quite a bit better for my taste. I think there's a lot of good Swedish black death metal that found a way beyond the Satanist. Uh, and I say that because Behemoth have a way of playing to the crowd. They have a way of they're no longer in that headspace of the bedroom black metal interest. They're not a hobbyist. They're professionals, and they're going to sound like professionals. They're going to be high fidelity every moment. They're going to be presenting big theatric songs. Uh, every uh, every box is checked. Every part of the checklist is finished. Like they presented a high standard for so long that it at this point an album like this loses all of its humanity outside of its lyrics. And what I mean is the production is so glossy, so loud, so just up there in your face. That's become what Behemoth is. And I feel like the last three records have been fighting against the loud, thunderous Polish death metal sound, which is kind of evolved into groove metal for a lot of other bands from that same scene that they came up around the time they did. Like, I won't get into, the litany of great groups out there, but everything from Trauma to, gosh, I don't know. I think uh, Hate is probably the one people know best, who kind of rid- ridden those coattails in a lot of ways. Uh, so this record plays to the crowd, but it does a lot of really interesting things in the periphery. And unfortunately, they're only just daring enough for my taste on a couple of songs here. And then they're just catchy enough on a couple of other songs in here that about half the album really hits for me. Most of it is pretty solid. I'll go see them live and enjoy it. I'll listen to this record and enjoy it, but it doesn't hit the point of just mind-blowingly good. It doesn't, like, at this point they're preaching to the choir, and the choir is just raising their arms in the air and screaming hallelujah, and I'm there for it. I like it, but uh yeah, it doesn't feel like it has that edge in the same way. Their music, their sound. We're not quite in riff metal territory. We're not quite in sing along songs territory. We're not quite brutal. We're not quite choral. We're not quite sophisticated progressive. We're not quite anywhere. So there's a as much power and brutality is put into this record. It's there's a limbo to it, and I didn't feel like I fell out of that until we had hit on like the really catchy chorus driven songs like The Deathless Sun, Once Upon the Pale Horse has a cool like progression to it, and versus Christus is the only song that really took me out of what I had expected. So I'm not disappointed at all with it. I think it's a good album. I think the art direction is very cool. You know, uh, the influence of like Deicide and uh, Florida death metal on Polish or Polish extreme metal has always been so understated that I like looking at this. to me, this could. It's sort of like, oh, is look at a record like Legion, and then look at the design of a record like this, and you're like, I feel like there's something to be said for seeing what worked in the past, and then sort of translating it to your own gig, and then anyway, that's a good record. Most people will have heard it. Uh, like I said, preaching to the choir. Um, Iro koi vistoinen Iro. I don't know how you pronounce it. Probably just Iro. Uh, and his quartet. I put out a couple of albums in the last 4 years. He's a jazz musician who's uh, known for playing the saxophone, known for his compositions, and if you're learning the history of jazz in Finland and Scandinavia, you know his name, and it's the type of if you're going to a museum of jazz history, you're going to read a jazz history, uh, like a Finnish jazz history rundown, or you're getting educated on just what jazz, like how jazz became known in Scandinavia. You'll know that he was one of the people in the late 60s to personalize it to the Finnish identity and of music identity. The sonic identity of Finland arrived through his abstraction. He studied at Berkeley and came back in the late 60s and applied that to his craft. And, a young guy who just worked on so much music that he became known for, what Finnish people would be, turn into their own sort form of jazz. There's a long, complex history of jazz in Finland. I think it's really worth reading through because they had a very stiff, uncomfortable way of playing it early on that they didn't really understand the swing of it, and so the swing arrives much later than the late 20s. So anyway, I won't bother. I spent hours reading about it, preparing to sort of try to condense that, though, like who this guy is. But here, jazz it tends to be pretty timeless, but this is someone who kind of became noticed in the late 60s and early 70s. So there is some of that contemporary jazz feeling to it. It's not so abstract and so modern. Uh, it it's very much well, like the previous album uh, was a little bit more abstract. It was warm. It felt very much studio assisted and present in a very small room. This feels like a bigger room. It feels like a jam in studio. This The sound quality is just very fine on this record, and they really emphasize the what would I call it? The It's the milky tone of the saxophone, uh, where the rhythm section is a little bit muted for my taste. I really would like to hear more of the drums and the bass, but the piano is a big part of this work, and the piano player is well known. So they kind of trade back and forth most of the time in a way that you would expect on a jazz record if you listen to jazz. Like it's run based more than riff based this time around. It's there's like an ebullience. There's a cheerfulness to it. It's a lot of detail. It's a very active record. It's not elevator music where you're just sleepily following the progressions. It's more active, observational, uh, drinking your coffee while looking at a busy highway. That kind of feeling to it. Um, there's a like a the buzz of stepping into from a liminal space into a crowded airport. It has that feeling when you start a song. So I really appreciate it. I kind of went through his history of releases as far as what I could gather as I was, listening to this, and um, I found a couple of ones that I liked in there. So it's sort of like a discography I'd like to explore more. Uh, but I just also I think this is just aesthetically a very pleasing record to pick up. Uh, I think that album cover is pretty striking, and the album just sounds great. I couldn't recommend it enough. Um, I don't think a lot of people who read my stuff listen to jazz, but there you go. Crone. Crone is a gothic alternative rock band from members of a brutal death metal band and an atmospheric black metal band. Now, Secrets of the Moon, right? Secrets of the Moon, they were technically Secrets of the Moon were already a gothic metal band. The guy just, I think they disbanded. They were done, but they had started leaning towards gothic metal on the last few releases. Uh, so you kind of already know his voice from those dips into it. They're more of an avant-garde black metal band who incorporated some gothic metal over time. This is just a pure gothic metal band, and I'm sorry, gothic rock band. They are an alternative rock band, and their style is something closer to later Sentenced in terms of the sort of rock yowl to it. Maybe not quite a Pain of Salvation, but uh, they take a lot of influence from like Pink Floyd and New Model Army and these other sort of well-known new wavy kind of goth bands. And I feel like it's all leading to progressive rock territory, like gothic progressive, but they're not there yet because they're really overthinking these songs. They're so elaborately phrased. The lyrics are kind of bad, and it has a very sophisticated charm to it. But there's such a struggle to this album and listening to the vocals, and it's just it just does not land for me. I there's a couple of great songs in here. They build up that like je ne sais quoi, over time. It is an interesting album to come back to, but it's just it didn't feel genuine. It felt so forced. I just I couldn't get there with this one. I think the instrumentation is fantastic. These are great musicians, but they're just very overcomplicated songs for what they're trying to do. And the shorter, simpler songs are where they get it best. I think that they have to decide if they're going to be like an 80s prog rock hit machine, or are they going to try to be a 90s, you know, gothic rock sad fest, or are they going to be like a Catatonia style band? Like there's a little bit of everything. So it just wasn't right for me. I kind of like the last one because it kind of leaned into like post rock and it felt a little bit modern. This feels just not sure of its identity, despite how professional and sharp it is and how well done every part of it is. It doesn't feel like they know where they're going with it, or they're just getting lost in in the details. So, uh, no, so Nordjebel's uh, Gnavhul, Gnavhul, however you'd say it, is one of the better records out this month. It's let's call it a black death metal record. Maybe I'll call it just a black metal record, but this is so gosh. So it's a Norwegian group. You can tell these people have a nice long history in Norwegian black metal. The guitar playing is fantastic, but there's no way to describe exactly how brutal they are until you've sat with this record. And if you know Merkskog, if you know Zyklon, Destructor is in this band, and you can tell he's in this band because he's a fantastic guitar player. But really, what's the drummer's name? Nils Fjellstrom, however you would say that. He's basically an insane beast on this record. Like he just punishes the kid all throughout this thing. It's kind of nuts. Like I couldn't stop listening to it just because I haven't heard anything so brutal in so long. Um, and not for lack of like death metal in my head, you know, it's just like in terms of black metal, the this level of precision, aggression, it's really unique to these artists and the way that they've, you know, the stupid sort of overdone brutality of like Dark Funeral and certain Marduk records. Um, you know, nothing against Marduk. I think I really like that side of the band. Uh, these guys have found a way to do that and make it their own. Some of them who've done it in the past. So it, it's just really good. Like I sat with this record for way too long and just enjoyed it way too much. I think it's because I want another Mjörkskog album. Uh, but this is just as it really is just as good. It really fills that need in a way where it feels modern. It feels a little bit more modern, a little bit less kind of industrial charged. Um, and yeah, I was trying not to gush over too much. I didn't have much to say about it, but it's just like, yes, I want that. I want that record. um, so, uh, yeah, I probably should have put the work in and wrote a full review, but the gist of it is just like listen to the drumming, wait for the riffs to kick in. Uh, there's a lot of dynamic. There's a lot of ideas. Like they really machined through this album in a way that is so satisfying to listen to, and it's not a headache ass record for how brutal it is. So yeah, for me that's just a uh, that will end up on my end of the month list. I've been listening to it too much. Um, so uh, Pirkan, Pirkan, however you pronounce that, is a Hungarian experimental drone group. Um, yeah, psychedelic folk is how they put it. Definitely has like a drum circle metal vibe, a drone, organic drone. Um, it's one of a few records here at the second half of the list where there's the choice of sounds and their craft of the songs is obviously well considered, and the real main event here is the title track. Um, there's some interesting sort of bagpipe-esque sounds they get out of, I think, an ebow and guitars. It does have sort of a shamanic doom feeling to some of it. It's a pretty cool record. I think that it just kind of falls apart without any direction in the second half. The shorter transitional songs start to stand out more than the larger pieces, and I found myself kind of skipping over the larger pieces as I continued to listen to it. So each piece is novel. None of it is all that memorable except for like certain, again, like the title track is quite, the way it starts is very cool. They're sort of using it sounds like creaks and floorboards that they're making a beat out of, and for me that just, it's something I want to keep listening to. I want to keep picking up. I had to talk about it. So there you go. Ovo is an Italian experimental rock duo. Rock, what does that mean? Well, they don't really rock, they're just weird. So it's a experimental metallic noise band as well. So think of, so Relapse's sort of power violent sludge era, uh, pulled away from hardcore punk, directed a little bit towards more like noise rock and noise metal, and you get something closer to Thor's hammer, is how I put it, and Nadja. So this album is it's two big pieces. Each has four movements. All of them play with everything from string noise to pure, you know, pure garage style sludge metal. It feels very live. It feels improvised. It's unique, and the vocal sort of the rhythmic vocal work. Uh, I feel like the collaboration could get bigger at this point. I think they're 9 albums in, 9 or 10, and I feel like it might be time to expand the rep. Now that I've listened, I like before I wrote this, I hadn't listened to more of the records. I listened to more of the records, and I feel like generally they just maybe need more input or more interesting sound design to get there for me. I think that the noise elements of their music are not that interesting, and the sludge side of it is just okay. It's just, the exploration is working for me on this record more than it has on some of their others. So uh, I think that score is about right. I think it's a cool record. I like the cover, uh, but it's not. They haven't quite. The discography really didn't hook me. I think this is a high point in it though. Um, Sanja, Sonya, Wow, I never even thought about how I pronounce that. Is it Sanja or Sonya? I think Sonya sounds cooler, right? Louder Iver is their debut full length. It is much anticipated. She put out a single in 2018. I think at that time it was like an idea that was pretty much ready, but then the pandemic hit and they recorded some of it in 2020, and then I think they finished it in 2021. So we're getting it, and vinyl delays, everything has been delayed. Uh, we haven't heard anything from her since the last uh, the what the 2011 Absu record. Um, and I won't really get into all that stuff. I think it's pretty well stated why that fell apart, and um, you know, what could I say that would be pretty neutral? It's hard to be neutral in a situation like that. I think um, it sort of worked out for the best. All right, maybe it was just a necessary separation, but I can imagine the hardship and the what I would consider pain and suffering that goes in, like when you're all into something and someone says no, when you're gated from what you do best. That's disappointing. That hurts. And I know that from experience where you're on fire, you're in your prime, and someone says no. So, and not related to your musical ability at all. Discrimination doesn't, that'll just never, that leaves a mark, right? Enough said. So that really, this album deals with that very directly and in ways that are interesting. It's very much a revenge based album. Um, uh, in terms of lyrics, the style of it is very much new wave of traditional heavy metal. It's got a little bit of so here's my thing, and I'll go on a different rant now. New wave of traditional heavy metal. Are they trying to bring back glam, or are they misrepresenting 80s metal? Because what we hear most of the time is sort of the fluffy rock that came once bands like Judas Priest joined in and records like Turbo started happening. So, uh, what does that mean? It means we get a lot of Scorpions records that are kind of bad. We get a lot of the peripheral, like glam metal shit. Fuck glam metal. Fuck all of it. Fuck Whitesnake and fuck you. But this isn't exactly that. There is the other side of it is the uh, gothic metal influence stuff, the gothic rock influence stuff. I don't call it post punk because you're losing the plot at that point. Call it new wave if you will, but that's still not right. Um, what I'll compare it to is Lunar Shadows, Cauldron, Spell. There's an ethereal uh, sort of range to the vocals that reads as dramatic, distant, mythic. It's pretty interesting. So it's what I describe it as a Vaseline smeared lens. There's definitely a glowy sort of feeling to the whole record. Now, not in terms of guitar work. In fact, this is a fantastic guitarist. She's like everything she's ever released except for Triple X Maniac uh, had fantastic guitar playing, and this is no exception. That guitar tone, which I believe she generally plays a Telecaster. It's just it it's the first thing that explodes out of this music because the vocals are a little bit subdued. The rhythm section is there, but they're supportive. So this really is a guitar album. It's a guitar driven heavy metal album, and like I want to emphasize that like uh, outside of Summerlands or Sumerlands, however you pronounce that, this has that Scorpions vibe in like a real way where there are songs, like good songs, catchy songs. I didn't like that first single. I thought Nylon Nights was kind of cheesy, but the opener, When a Candle Burns Low, is, God, that sold me on the album right away. I think Pink, whatever it is, I can't remember the name of the song. Uh, Pink Energy. That's probably not Pink Energy. Uh, and then, what was it? Daughter of the Morning Star is the best song on the album. Uh, that's where I would go directly, besides the opener, as to what's really great on there. And my only note was that the vocals could use a little bit more of a kick, a kick there once in a while to sort of get to the chorus and punch it out. There are several songs where they do it, but yeah, the style today is just to sort of subdue it back to sort of a hazy glam sort of kickback. So uh, I'm pretty enthusiastic about this one. I think it turned out really well. I was sort of like after I heard that first single, I was like, I don't know. I want to, I want to support it, but I'm not sure. But now that they've heard the record, yeah, this is a great heavy metal album, and like I said, one of the better traditional metal records out this year. Um, you know, if you have any reason to dislike it, it should be musical. That's all I have to say. Like it should be musical. Uh, I can leave it at that. And I like the music, so there you go. Pet Brick. Okay, Pet Brick. Well, let's see. Igor Cavalera from Sepultura and various other bands um, has been involved in electronic music for quite a long time, both as, I think initially as a DJ, but also some industrial projects. He guests in another band, I forget the name of them. And then well, Wayne Adams does quite a lot. He's sort of the collaborator here. And Wayne Adams is known for producing a lot of great noise rock and indie rock bands. Various groups that he's played in that are pretty experimental. And this is sort of an experimental electronic ish project. I say ish because there's a lot that goes into this. It's a little bit industrial, it's a little bit of like IDM, it's a little bit of experimental noise. Uh, I think I get the sense that they're just kind of having fun and doing what comes naturally, and they just happen to be very good at what they do between the engineer's mind and who knows all the possibilities in the studio, and then percussion taught instrumentalist who has a real knack for composition that hits. Um, so their tastes collide in like a really interesting way on Liminal. I think it's their second full length, and there's a lot of guests on here, but they did a collaborative album with Deaf Kids, and in many ways, like what Deaf Kids do, which is a very abstract work, has translated into what Pet Brick do in a similar way. So Deaf Kids have more of like a punk, crust punk defiance to their works. These are probably a little bit more accessible, a little bit more noise rocky, a little more uh, industrial dance, sort of like not quite IDM, but there's no way to sit here and if you want me to go through it track by track, I think I could eventually describe what's happening at any given moment. But as a whole, it's a collection of ideas that are they're pretty cool. Like, what else can you say? Cosmic Ground. Yeah, Cosmic Ground is a synthesizer based. What would I call it? Electronic crowd, like post kraut synthesizer based atmospheric project from Dirk Jan Mueller, who he plays in a band Electric Orange, who've been around since the '90s. They play a psychedelic rock slash cosmic rock style of music. They're actually quite good. I would check out their other stuff to sort of get a sense of his like keyboard style that he plays in that band. He is influenced by like Klaus Scholz, obviously. That kind of plays into some of the stuff he does on here, and you really get the best sense of what this album is when you hit the 18-minute pieces. There's four 18-minute pieces, well, 10 to 18-minute pieces that finish off the record, and the first few pieces introduce his sort of more cinematic uh, layering of pieces, and it warms you up to his vintage synthesizer sounds, which range from 70s to 90s, as far as the way I see it. But his work has more depth than a lot of the sort of 70s unlock of the sequencer and the 90s unlock of just layered production tricks and uh, tape modulation and things like that. You're going to pick up on it if you're a nerd for that kind of thing, but otherwise, it's just kind of a nice, pleasant listen of electronic music. And there's a lot of successful atmosphere that happens on this record that eventually becomes engrossing. It's a good time. Uh, so it's a good introduction to what he does. But uh, I'd probably recommend Electric Orange as like if you're not ready to step into a full hour of electronic music. Start with Electric Orange. So yeah, that's it. That's for the week. You got other opinions? Go keep them to yourself. That's all I got.